Welcome to this episode of Energy Radio, a podcast by CEM Engineering with the goal of giving you the knowledge and the tools and the power to manage your energy.
Welcome to this episode of Energy Radio, podcast by CEM Engineering. I'm here today with Diego Mandelbaum, the VP of Development with CREATIVENERGY.
That's right.
Get all that right?
You got it. You got it. Perfect.
Right on. Good.
You even pronounced the name right.
Okay. It's a great name. I can't believe it's real. It's probably made up.
Argentine Jewish.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Good. Well, welcome. Welcome to this part of the world. I understand you're kind of a new resident of Southern Ontario. Is that right?
This is correct. I'm a Torontonian as of September of last year.
Okay. Cool.
And so I just made my way over here from Vancouver.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Well, sorry about the weather.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's warm here, and all my colleagues in Vancouver are snowed in right now. So I'm actually,
that's right.
yeah.
Yes,
So I'm laughing at all of them whenever I'm in
Good.
conference calls.
So was it if I may ask, was it a work-related move to move here, or family, or what prompted you to leave beautiful BC to come to the GTA?
I like the overpasses here.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of concrete. It's really nice.
The traffic jams. That go
Yeah, I enjoy traffic. Get to listen to
Okay.
more radio, more advertisement. It was certainly a professional move.
Okay, cool.
Essentially, I was a consultant in my past life, and
Okay.
Creative Energy was a client of mine.
Yes.
And I started working with them. They said, "Hey, we're trying to grow this business. We see a huge opportunity in Ontario. We want to go
Okay.
scale the business, and we want to grow in the GTA. Do you want to go open the office and lead that growth?"
No way. Okay.
And I said, "Yeah, absolutely."
Okay. Cool. Great. Well, we'll unpack that a little bit. But first, from our research, you were I gotta get this right, Toshido MMA. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
So you were like a participant in that?
I was a mixed martial arts fighter for a little while.
Okay.
I was quite serious about it for a few years.
Wow.
And then as I started getting more into my engineering career and also had a bit of face surgery to fix some broken bones in there,
No way.
realized I should probably make a choice of being an engineer or getting punched in the face.
Okay.
I made the engineering choice.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you miss it though?
I do, but I'm still quite active in the wrestling and jiu-jitsu side of it. I
Okay.
just said I don't want to get hit or kicked in the head anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm still on the mat about 3 or 4 times a week if I can be.
Good for
Yeah.
you. And so you've found a community to kind of settle into here in Toronto with that activity.
Oh, certainly have.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
It took a little bit.
Yeah.
Went to a few gyms to find the right training
Okay.
partners, some bigger
Okay.
guys, but
Wow.
found a good place here and get some good mat time.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you got a way to keep your competitive juices flowing.
Yep, it's
Yeah,
my therapy outside of
Okay,
work.
Cool. So you mentioned it briefly, but you were one of us, kind of before where you are now.
Yes.
With Stantec.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So how long were you there? What kind of stuff were you doing?
Yeah, sure. So I started with Stantec 2011
Okay.
in a small town called Kamloops in British Columbia.
Sure. Yeah.
Shortly after that, moved over to Kelowna, which is where I actually grew up,
Okay.
also in British Columbia.
Okay.
And I was leading the office in Kelowna,
Okay.
running a team of mechanical and electrical engineers working on buildings, particularly in the institutional field.
Okay.
A lot of healthcare, a lot of education, some
right on.
industrial. I was there from 2011 till about 2017, and then I was tapped on the shoulder to see if I wanted to move to Vancouver and take on a bit more of a provincial leadership role.
Wow.
And so I did that in 2017.
Okay.
Moved out that way, and I was one of 5 managing principals for the Buildings Engineering and Architecture group,
Wow.
which was about 300 to 350 folks, evenly divided between engineering and architecture.
Okay.
And we really worked on buildings of all sorts, from military bases to hospitals to industrial sites to private development.
Wow.
So from my curiosity perspective, I got to see a good cross-sector
Yeah.
of the economy, actually.
No kidding. And was that like a big organization like Stantec? Was that kind of a center of excellence for that, or was that like a regional focus, or like were you working on stuff just on the west coast, or like?
No, so we were a bit of both. We were
Okay.
on the West Coast, we were in British Columbia.
Yeah.
That was the primary business we had,
Yeah.
but we certainly had some expertise that was, I would say, a center of excellence that went global.
Yeah.
So from that group, we worked on a $1 billion hospital in Qatar, Doha,
Wow.
which was quite interesting. We were working on projects, particularly in the healthcare world, across Canada, some in the States. The Department of National Defense was one of the major clients there, so we got to work on military bases across Canada. Actually, when I left there, we were looking at a project in Italy, so there was a lot of, I would say, brain power we got to export just because we had the certain critical mass there
Yeah,
within
cool.
the group that was fairly far-reaching.
Yeah. So if I'm following along, you're 2011 you start at Stantec, and then by 2017, 2018, you're in this kind of, what you call managing principal?
Yeah.
That's, sounds like a pretty steep arc to your career. Like that's
I
pretty
well, what,
impressive, I think.
well, thank you. But what happened? I found the guy who's in charge of all those decisions. I just gave him $20, and then
Okay.
it, like
Yeah,
the
excellent.
next day I got a promotion.
Yeah, okay. Good.
Super easy.
Great.
Yeah.
So for the CEM employees who are listening, it's maybe a bit more than $20, but that approach would work here too.
It works most places. Yeah.
So, but like, what do you attribute that to? Like that is a, you know, all joking aside, that is pretty impressive in a big organization like Stantec to get to that regional leadership role pretty quickly.
Well, I appreciate that. It's there's probably three things I'd attribute to.
Okay.
One of them is espresso. I've got an addiction. I drink a lot of them. It fuels me. The other one is I was incredibly fortunate and lucky in terms of some of the mentorship I had.
Okay.
I happened to fall into being lucky enough to work with a couple of the folks who really had an impact on my career,
Yeah.
both in terms of what I got to learn, but also advocacy within the company, which
Okay.
is huge in a company of that size.
Yeah,
And lastly, I would say two more things. One is opportunity in terms of when I was in Kelowna. It happened to be in a very bad moment for the office. There was no work, there was no people, no leadership. So
Okay.
I was just by happenstance of timing. They
Yeah.
said, "Hey, you're the best we have. We don't.
Okay.
You're not the right person, but you want to take the role on."
Oh, neat. Okay.
so
right place at the right
yeah,
time kind of thing.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing too, the team I was able to work with,
Yeah.
that I don't want to say worked for me, I would say I worked for them.
Yes.
They were phenomenal. So they had my back. I would come out, I would go sell these crazy ideas, crazy
Yeah.
timelines, crazy project, whatever it was. I'd turn around and say, "Hey guys, this is what we have to do," and they just say, "Sure, let's do it."
Cool. Neat.
Yeah. So I was incredibly lucky, I would say.
And in the Kelowna role, so it was kind of, you had both a business development role and a project execution
That's
role?
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's
And
exactly
the
right.
work was mostly, in that role, was more regional to Kelowna then?
Yeah, so what's interesting about a town, if anybody here watching knows the interior of British Columbia, if you
Yeah.
live in Kelowna, you don't work in Kelowna, you work in the entire sort of interior region.
Okay.
And so the geography we covered really went, I would say, 200-kilometer radius, maybe even more,
Yeah.
out to the Caribou area, out to the Kootenay area, down to the Merritt area.
Wow.
And so I got to travel into every little small town BC had to
Nice.
offer, at least in that part of the world.
Yeah. Wow. And did you, when you moved into that role, did Stantec give you, I'm asking these questions kind of somewhat selfishly
Sure,
as
sure.
we grow, but did you, were you given like training in that role? Was there a crash course in, because now you're quickly confronted with, managing people and projects and HR stuff, the whole myriad of things, right? Like, how was Stantec in terms of enabling you to succeed in that role?
It was pretty good. So I mean, most of the learning really was through mentorship and experience, and really screwing up.
Yeah.
That's the one thing. I think I was the guy willing to make the most amount of mistakes.
Yeah. Okay.
So I was that guy.
Yeah.
Stantec did have some conventional training for how to be a supervisor, how to
Okay.
do some of the leadership things that you need to do. Not so much on the sales side, but was really a fantastic program they had. I don't know if they still have it or not. Every year they had what they would call the Emerging Leaders Program, which was
Okay.
sort of a very narrow list of candidates who were sort of mid-level in their career, kind of with good potential. And they would bring in an executive coach that was generally more towards a C-suite coaching, things like that. And it would be a one-year program where a group of about 20 people selected in Western Canada go once a month. They spend these 3-day workshops, and really it teaches you everything about the softer side, the EQ, the communication styles, leadership, all the things that as an engineer by training, and I see your pinky ring, so I think you're one too, we don't really get taught that.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And that really had a really good impact on me. So
Yeah.
Stantec certainly provided a lot of support there.
Now, the other piece that I think as engineers we don't get the best training on is the business side and,
No, we don't.
and the sales side, right? And there's kind of project development, there's the big stuff, the elephant hunters, but there's also in engineering, particularly consulting, there's this notion of a seller doer.
Yes.
I guess two-part question. What set you on that road in terms of seeing that was something you needed to do? And two, was it just a learning by doing, or how did you get comfortable and equipped to do it?
Yeah, that's a heck of a question. The one thing I realized when I was fairly young in my career, I thought, if I want to grow up in this company or get to establish my resume, I want to be leading these projects.
Yeah.
When I was in EIT, they would say, well, you're not experienced enough, you don't have this, or you don't have that. And so then in my mind, I said, well, the easiest way to become a project manager is by go winning my own work. It's really hard to say, hey guys, I brought in all this money here and all these clients, but I can't lead this project now.
Cool.
So I figured I'll go win some work. I did.
Nice.
And then nobody really contested that. And from there it grew, and I kind of liked what it felt like to be able to go get your own clients, build a business. You get to go hire people, and then you get to hopefully manage their expectations. So I think it naturally progressed, but just to your point about the seller-doer, I'm a strong believer that that is the way that both consultants and even in my industry, that is the way to provide value.
Yeah.
I don't like the detachment of the business development or sales to the engineering.
Yeah.
I think they are fundamentally intertwined.
Well, and certainly from the perspective of the client, that handover, if there is a discrete handover between sales and execution, that's a potential for a lot of stuff to get missed, right? So if there's continuity from who initiates the work to who executes it, ultimately the biggest benefactor in my experience is the end client, right?
Absolutely.
They benefit from that continuity throughout, right?
Absolutely.
And then what I say, because I spend a lot of time developing business myself, so I can say this, but what I say to our teams is, the clients don't really want to talk to me anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They want to talk to the person that's going to be executing the work, right? So we're the reason I'm kind of digging deep on this is selfish, like I said, because we're trying to move towards a more diversified kind of way that business comes into the office. It's still a lot of elephant hunting.
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 individuals, and we have a phenomenal team that like you, I think, can easily go and get to work and come back and execute. So I appreciate you kind of sharing your insights into the early career of Diego.
Sure. And I would maybe just correct, I don't think I can easily do both those things. I can easily do those if I have a good team supporting me and a good mentor helping me. So I've been very lucky. I want to make sure that the folks who supported me are getting the credit they deserve.
So on that notion of mentoring, like you quickly pointed that out as an impetus for your career. What did it take for that? Like what circumstances allowed that to happen? My sense is it's a two-way street, but talk to me about what situation was created that allowed that to kind of happen for you.
Sure. And it's looking back, the way that I saw it, because I got to fairly quickly be from a position where I was always trying to get mentorship to being able to give back a little bit. I mean, I still to this day have some mentors that I look up to.
Cool.
But what I found, and I noticed this as I've become a mentor to some of the folks that I worked with back at Stantec, there's a lot of younger folks who say, this is what I want to do. And you say, okay, great, how are you going to get there? And they say, well, you've got to change my utilization, or you've got to shift my job description so I can go do that.
Yeah.
And to me, the answer is no, that's not your job. Your 9-to-5 job is to do what's in your job description.
Right.
Over and above that, go find a way to develop business, to go develop technical standards, go do whatever it is that really you're passionate about. But that's your self-development. And I found most of the engineering folks I would deal with kind of looked at it and said, well, no, I want to be at home doing whatever after 5. Not everybody, but I was one of those people who said, no, I get it. My 50-hour work week is my job as an EIT, go design, go do this, and everything else I'm going to do will be over and above it.
Yeah.
And I think because I would do that, there's a lot of senior folks who said, hey, look, this guy's got a little bit more fire to put in the hours and to learn some things outside what we're asking him.
Yeah.
So let's try to harness that a little bit.
Okay. And so you demonstrate an initiative and a desire, and then the mentors see that, and then they make themselves kind of available for ongoing mentoring.
I think so. And listen, the other reality of it is too is we're engineers in consultancy. You're surrounded by engineers. My persona in a legal firm probably wouldn't differentiate myself. My persona in an engineering firm, all of a sudden, I'm a little bit different. So,
Interesting.
I think, and I think talking to you seem like you're also fairly outgoing, extroverted. I think because we happen to be in an engineering role, which is mostly the opposite, we get to have a differentiating quality because of that.
Yeah.
That you may not have if you're in the finance or legal world or accounting world, because you have a lot of those type of people.
Yeah. I also think that with mentorship, like there's this aspect of both sides. There has to be a level of kind of humility and willingness, right, on both sides, the mentor, but also the mentee, to say, I don't know everything, right? And I need, and I think that's something that when you're early on, I know for me when I was early on in my career, I think it's easy to kind of fall into a sense of confidence, and you have a couple early wins. But was that hard for you, or did you always have that desire to learn, and that humility to say, teach me. I'm a sponge here, kind of thing.
I've always been a very inquisitive person,
Okay.
and so I've always had that desire. I've realized as I progress my career and arguably learn more and more, I become less confident and realize I know less and less.
Yeah.
So I remember when I graduated engineering, I thought I was the smartest guy in the world, that everybody should hire me, that I could do all this math, that you're not gonna find anybody else like me. And now I realize, wow, there's a lot of smart people out there, and there's a lot I don't know. So I've got to be very humble to try to absorb what I can from the other folks.
Around our shop, we call that a healthy dose of fear. You know where your skills are and where you need help beyond them.
Yeah, and it's almost that learning curve of first you don't know what you don't know, and then you
Right.
know what you don't know, then it progresses on that way, and then it cycles back.
And then you get to the point where you've forgotten more.
Yeah.
So before we leave the Stantec phase of your career, because really we want to talk about creative energy, but is there a project that sticks out to you or an achievement where you're like, yeah, that was, we did some really good work there, or you look back and think that was a special time?
Yeah, I would say there's two. One of them is not a project. One of them was more of a long-term plan of being able to revitalize the office in Kelowna.
Right.
And just because when I went there, it was due to some economy and some past projects, it was not doing very well. It was a very small market. It was a group that needed work from abroad, and it was not profitable. I was given a shot with 2 people working with me, and we scaled that up to about 14 people in a very short amount of time, or 12 people, I can't remember exactly. No, and again, it wasn't me though. It was there was the team there, but that was probably the most fun I've had in my career.
Cool.
It was a true sense of a team that we all were on the same mission. They weren't big, exciting projects. There was nothing that you'd get published in a magazine for. But we all had this shared goal of let's go revitalize the office, and I think it worked.
Cool.
And actually, one of my really good friends and ex-colleagues is now running that team
fun.
there.
Nice.
And I think he's doing a phenomenal job.
Cool.
From a project perspective, I would say the project that really sticks out for me is a project I did with Thomson Rivers University.
Okay.
And ironically, we're now working with them again,
neat.
looking at doing some district energy work with them.
Okay.
But it was the new Industrial Training and Technology Center that was developed a couple years ago, and it was really a sophisticated trades building.
Yeah.
Part of the project was to put in a central heating plant that would be low carbon and not only heat that building, but backfeed the adjacent building that was about 4 times larger and offset their natural gas and have some two-way energy sharing for resiliency purposes.
Yeah.
Getting that project off the ground, there's all sorts of hoops financially, politically, and we had a biomass plant there that did not go through council due to some sensitivities on the local air pollution piece of it.
Okay.
So we ended up doing an electric solution where it was a small district system to heat and then backfeed another building. It did some energy sharing. We had a lot of folks tell us it's the wrong way to do it. It's going to be super expensive. And it was really the client, Thomson Rivers University, they had a conviction of what sustainability meant to them to do it, even though it may have cost them more. We made it past all the hoops, even though we had our project managers telling us not to do it. We had boards telling us not to do it. We had BC Hydro telling us not to do it, at the same time incentivizing us. And after it was done, it worked really well. We, unfortunately, in the startup, we had an issue, so we actually got to see the backfeeding of the energy sources work and work well. So the resiliency piece sort of checked the box.
Cool.
And it really got a ton of publicity and started them on their way of the sort of electrification and decarbonization plan. It was a really fun project. Not the most technologically sophisticated project, but the process to get there was a lot of fun, and we've gotten a chance to present at a few conferences on it now as well.
And excuse my ignorance, but where is it located?
Oh, it's, Kamloops, British Columbia.
Kamloops, okay.
Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
Apologies to those and to our listeners in Kamloops for my ignorance.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's in Toronto, we think that the axis of the world kind of comes through the middle of Toronto. So
we're in the center of the universe, I was told
that's
before
right.
moving here.
Yeah, that's right. So the source of heat is electric?
It is electric, and electric resistive. And the reason, and that's why we got a lot of pushback, because as an engineer, I cringed a little bit. I said, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
We were tying to an existing high temp system.
Okay.
It was designed the whole time to be a biomass plant, so low carbon and high temp.
Yeah.
The building started getting built. We were having a separate plant there, prefabricated. We had the designs ready. We had the pricing in. Council had a bylaw that said thou shalt not use outdoor wood-fired boilers, and that was referring to the more backyard boiler, right?
Very familiar with it.
So we went to council. We said, guys, sustainability is what we're really pushing here. This is why we did the emission study, their quality testing, all that stuff. We showed them the science, said it works well. They said we agree. Went to council. They rescinded that bylaw.
Okay.
We were super happy. We were ecstatic. We're celebrating.
Yeah.
Protest then subsued outside of the city hall. There was an emergency council meeting. They rescinded the rescinding of the bylaw. And we then had a building that had no space in it for a boiler plant. There's no
Right.
program area left to carve it out there.
Yeah.
And so we said, well, heck, we'll put a little natural gas prefab plant on a hill somewhere and tie it up. And that's
Yeah.
where TRU said, or Thompson Rivers University
Yes.
said, no, we won't. We are committed to sustainability. And if that means we're
Wow.
going to pay 2 times or 3 times in rates, we will
Yeah.
do that.
Wow.
Now, this is actually maybe a piece that's interesting to talk on. What got us the buy-in we needed there, because we had a lot of people saying, you're crazy, you're spending 3 times more on electricity, all these
Yeah,
things,
yeah.
was the way we defined a business case. And what I mean by that is initially when folks were coming to us and saying, you're going to spend 3 times more than you would if you put in a gas plant there, we said that's sure, but that's not the business case we're defining.
Okay.
The definition was the university made a commitment to decarbonize the campus. The GHG offsets we would have by going with that route.
Yes.
If you look at where else you could get that same reduction in GHG elsewhere on the campus,
Yeah.
and the money you would spend,
Aha.
it was far more than the spark spread.
Aha.
And so when you redefined it that way, and you said, if we're going to save this many kilograms or tons of GHG a year, and we don't want to do it here, we don't want to pay that annual premium on utilities, where else can we do it? All of a sudden, that business case equalized out a little bit.
So you reframed so the comparison initially was a straight business case of, electric boilers essentially,
Yep.
right? With a significant premium on the fuel. You comparing that against a cheap, dirty by comparison.
Sure.
Fuel and the capex associated, I would imagine, right? And so
And it wasn't actually, the capex was about the same, it was the OPEX, yeah,
okay. So
the OPEX.
The two side by side, the OPEX of the natural gas obviously makes more sense.
It's about a 3-time multiplier in BC.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, traditionally it'd be about a 3-time multiplier. Because they already purchased some offsets in renewable natural gas, it was actually only
Okay.
about a 2-time multiplier.
Okay, interesting. But you step back and you say, no, that comparison option isn't, it's just not a viable option. We have to set it aside because the campus has this conviction. So then you compare it to, if I'm understanding correctly, you take the GHG reductions and you say, where else can we get that? And the dollars per GHG,
Yeah.
the dollars per ton of
Yep.
GHG reduction compared to a portfolio of other projects. This was that's how you.
That's
Okay.
precisely it. And
Wow.
part of that rationale is because the past 10 years, the university, and myself included, spent time going building by building, trying to optimize, trying to replace boiler plants, doing
Right.
what we could.
Yeah.
And so I would say the energy efficiency measures were really exhausted. It
Yeah.
really came down to you have to fuel switch,
Yeah.
which is what I'm finding holistically now is
Yeah.
energy reduction measures are great, but they're not going to get us to where people say we have to get to.
But they do. One of the things that we talk about in our office is, and our founder Martin, will say he learned this in his, in the early '80s at McMaster, that when you look at energy and energy management, you start at the point of use, right?
Mhm.
And you deal with it there first, and then you deal with the distribution, and then you deal with the generation, and in that order. And we've come into sites where, the point of use is just, there's steam going everywhere, but they want to put in cogen. We love cogen, don't get me wrong, or we love we love new generation projects in general.
It's not the right
But
thing.
It's not the right thing,
Yeah.
right? And so it sounds like in this context, they had done all that stuff, and now it was, there was no more low-hanging fruit there. It was all about, we got to get right to the source
Yep.
and do a fuel switch, and it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that concept or strategy at all. I do think go find out where can we reduce things.
Yeah, you had done it here.
Yeah, and you've done it. And then I think this is maybe later in this conversation, but there's a bigger discussion holistically now as we're looking at building codes and policies both in Ontario and BC. How much onus do you put on the reduction versus on the supply when you're looking at envelope? And I would argue as we're looking at, say, the STEP code in British Columbia or even some of the thermal intensity demand or thermal energy demand intensities here in the Toronto Green Standard, I think we're starting to push the envelope requirements too far. We're not actually being the most economical we can if we're trying to reduce GHGs. But that might be going down another path. But it's yeah.
So you have this illustrious career, burgeoning career at Stantec, and how do you get from there to Creative Energy? Tell us that story.
I will. So I got to, when I moved to Vancouver, I got to know Creative Energy from a very similar industry.
Okay.
Right? We design buildings. They
Yes.
or we now, I guess, we heat them
Okay,
or cool them,
gotcha.
or in some cases power them.
Okay.
A lot of overlap there, and I just had a natural interest in that business.
I see.
The technical passion in me, I always liked designing central plants, whether that was for a hospital, for a university, or for a district system. So I was just taken away about the business of Creative Energy, what they did,
Gotcha.
the aspirations. I got to know one of my colleagues now, P.Eng McConnell, who's our Vice President of Projects and Engineering.
Okay.
I talked him into letting me work for him or for them as a
Okay.
consultant and doing some work on biomass design for a retrofit of our central plant downtown Vancouver,
Okay.
which I'll get into after.
Yeah.
I was doing some of that work, which was a lot of fun. And
So at this point, they're a client.
at this point, they're
Stantec,
clients
okay.
of Stantec, going through that process, and then I had a cryptic lunch or invite from our admin saying the CEO would like to have lunch with you.
Aha.
I assumed we're either getting fired, sued, or they're offering me a job.
Right. Okay.
Did not get fired or sued,
Okay.
and he explains what Creative Energy is, some of the
Yeah.
shifts, what we're looking to do over the next 5 years, and really aspirationally what it can become, the vision.
Yeah.
I would say that was pretty much had me at that lunch.
Okay. And home base is Vancouver for creative?
For creative, right now it is.
Okay.
Ask us that in about 5 years' time. I think we might say Toronto.
Okay. So you have lunch, you don't get sued or fired.
Yes.
You fast forward, you
And a client bought me lunch at the time, so
Yeah,
that was
there you go,
phenomenal.
There you go. So you joined the team.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about, let's step back for a minute and frame the discussion. Like, tell us about creative, brief history, kind of what you guys do, what you're about, how you're different. Just
Sure,
you know.
sure. So I'm going to go way back. I'll keep it brief, but I think it's there's an irony here that I think will not be lost on you or your viewers.
Okay, cool.
So Creative Energy was started back in the 60s. And so
Okay.
back in the 1960s, downtown Vancouver, fundamentally different than what it is today.
Yeah.
There was a real pollution and smog issue, and that was because every building had fuel oil boilers or coal boilers.
Yeah.
And so at the time, a group of local business people said, hey, we've got this phenomenal idea. It's the sustainable way of the future, natural gas.
Uh-huh.
And so at the time in the 60s, natural gas was a sustainable fuel.
Yes.
They purchased an old Vancouver Press building.
Yeah.
They retrofitted it with some very large natural gas steam boilers. They connected a couple buildings, and that was the start of the company.
Okay. So this is 60s?
In the 1968
So-
is when we had our first, sold our first BTU.
Wow. Okay, cool.
And so that's what started.
Yes.
And it's ironic because at the time sustainability was natural gas. Today we're
Yeah.
actually figuring out how to get off of
Off
natural
of it,
gas.
yes,
And I mean
yes.
that in that exact same plant.
Cool.
But over time that grew and grew and grew from one building to two buildings to 3 and 4 and 5. And then we had some very marquee customers connect to us, like
Okay.
St. Paul's Hospital,
Okay.
the stadium down there. I would say just about every core building in downtown Vancouver is connected to our plant. And then in 2014, there was a shift in ownership.
Okay.
And with the new ownership came a totally new vision.
Okay.
What happened up until that time, it was really a single asset that had more customers connected to
I
it,
see.
and that was
Okay.
the business.
Okay.
With the new ownership, it was that is no longer the business. We want to, A, decarbonize that plant,
Okay.
but B, we want to scale this thing 15, 20 times in size. We want to go across Canada, maybe even the States,
Okay.
and we want to develop low carbon district energy projects and
Yeah.
really have an impact.
Okay.
So that happened in 2014. Obviously, it takes a long time to repurpose
Sure.
a company.
Yeah.
But we're now starting to see that come in. So our current CEO joined us about 2 years ago, and
Okay.
that's a gentleman who's got, I think, is about as qualified for the roles you can have or be. Then he brought me on here.
Okay.
I've just opened up the office, and so now it's actually starting to progress. We've got a whole bunch of new projects in development,
Nice.
which is really exciting because for 50 years we were a single 280 megawatts, so large, but single
Yeah.
asset.
Yeah, okay. So, kind of your main core business is district energy.
Yes.
Essentially. You have this anchor plant that is going from natural gas to something.
Yes.
Which probably we'll talk about. And then, on the backs of that operating history, there's a desire to grow the business. Canada, North America, is there bounds around that, or?
We're boundless.
Okay.
However,
Yes.
strategically, right now, Canada is the focus, particularly the GTA area,
Okay.
and a little bit further in British Columbia. But we
Yeah.
really see the GTA as a fantastic opportunity.
Okay.
After that, we'll probably look at going down south, and we're actually looking at a few opportunities there already.
Okay.
And then after that, we'll see what happens. But
Yeah.
that's from our strategic perspective. That's really what we see is let's start BC and Ontario. we'll get into other parts of Canada and then go down south, and we're really seeing the plan coming together, I would say, quicker than we thought.
Yeah. So you have 50 years in Vancouver in one plant. So I would imagine they've given you lots of runway in Toronto to like what's the plan? What's the goals? Like what is because district energy development is not for the faint of heart, and it's not a quick kind of process. It's a lengthy process. Talk to me about you've opened the office. What's your plan, vision? Have you had some early successes? Like how are we doing here in Toronto?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. I mean, it's not for the faint of heart. There are long processes to get a project off the ground. There's multiple stakeholders. There's many competing priorities. There's a very strong technical piece of it, very strong economical piece of it, which is sort of part of the fun as well. What we found in Toronto is that we have Mirvish Village as our first project here.
Okay.
And so that project has helped give us a bit of credibility. So that I would say is our catalyst into this market.
Okay, cool.
And then coming out here, being able to leverage the expertise that we have from 50 plus years now of operating experience. We have, I mean, just for context, we have 220 customers connected there with 14 kilometers of piping.
Wow.
And can show over the last 50 years 99.99% reliability. We've been down for less than an hour.
Wow.
So that gives us a little bit of credibility coming out here to say we're not new at this. We're not just coming out here and saying we've got some financial backing, we can build things.
Yeah.
We're saying we have all that, but we actually have the expertise, and we're trying to innovate as well. We don't want to just go around doing conventional boiler projects. We want to see what's interesting out there.
Right.
Coming out here, what I'm finding is, there's a huge market for it because we don't have a whole lot of competition here. Obviously, the incumbent here is Enwave, and I think they've done some really good things. They've got a phenomenal deep lake system. You're not going to hear anything bad come out of my mouth about them. I think they've done great things for the industry. But you don't really find that there's a whole lot of other folks doing what we do in terms of being able to come and say, we are an energy developer. We will come design, build, own, operate, de-risk this thing, take the capital off your development hands, and then hopefully sell low carbon energy at a cost competitive rate.
Yeah.
So coming from a consulting background, I would say it was incredibly competitive to what we do now, where we're, I would say, more of a niche.
Yeah.
That's been really interesting and fun.
Yeah.
The difference, I would say, is more in the, I don't want to say sales process, but in how quick things turn around. If you're a consultant, you look at an opportunity, you might take a few months and you might be successful. Here, I'm looking with a development partner at 2 sites right now. It might be 3 years before we have a shovel in the ground, or 2 years. And the bigger the project, the more it will normally take. We're looking at an opportunity, for example, in British Columbia. The City of New Westminster has put out an expression of interest for a DE partner.
Okay.
They've started looking at that in 2011.
Wow.
So, we can move very quick, but a lot of times it's the stakeholders outside of our control, which really make these big developments take time.
Yeah. So, chuckle a little bit, because for us, organizationally, having served so many industrials, we've done district energy where we've done it in London with the hospitals, and we've done it with Hamilton Community Energy. But it is when you compare it to industrials who live quarter to quarter, that's a lot more fast making. Shit or get off the pot. And
we can swear on this thing?
We can, yeah.
Yes.
So that's it's been tough for us, but we also know that long term it's an area we want to stay involved in and get involved in. So you mentioned a project already in Toronto, Mirvish?
Yeah, Mirvish Village.
Tell us about that.
Sure. So Mirvish Village, it's on the corner of Bathurst and Bloor Street.
Okay.
So it's the redevelopment of the iconic Mirvish Village and Honest Ed site.
Yeah, okay.
And so what's happening there's going to be about 5 towers and just under 1 million square feet of purpose-built rental.
Okay.
And actually just yesterday it was released publicly that there's been some federal funding for affordable housing there. So it's a really good news story outside of the energy piece, just for the society.
Yeah.
And that's also our first project that we're looking at a district, or not looking, we're doing. We expect our first piece of equipment to actually touch base in the next couple months.
Cool.
And we also took an electrical run at that as well, which was our first, but hopefully not our last. And so that project, from a technological perspective, we are supplying, from a service perspective anyways, we're supplying thermal energy, cooling energy, or heating energy, cooling energy, electricity, and electrical emergency power as well.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah, so we're pretty much the wholesale utility or energy provider for the site.
So there's a load there already? Like it's a development project, but is there existing load?
There's not.
Okay.
So this is, we're developing with that,
Okay,
and they are,
wow.
that site is essentially our anchor
Yeah.
to establish a thermal network, establish our initial assets there, and then we hope to expand to the greater community, find more nodes. But that project's really interesting because it is, from the thermal side, we're getting the base load from a CHP machine.
Cool.
So we're doing that, providing space heating, domestic water heating, snow melting.
Yeah.
From the cooling side, it's a fairly conventional centrifugal chiller, some cooling towers. Down the road, we want to look at how we can add some storage and we can add some heat recovery as we expand and find some more nodes.
Nice.
But the electrical side is, to me, super interesting. We are the electrical utility for that site. And so essentially, we will buy some power from the greater utility.
Yeah.
We generate on site through a CHP machine and through a solar array, which is 5 or 10% of the energy.
Okay.
And then we own the microgrid that distributes that site,
Yes.
and then we get to give the power to all the buildings there. What's interesting? There's two things that really made sense for us, or three things. One, the CHP is something that made the project economical for us.
Okay.
Because of the spark spread. It let us move that forward and keep the rates competitive.
Yeah, nice.
And affordability and resiliency were probably the driving factors for that project. The other one is because we're aggregating all the buildings, we now have the opportunity to purchase power at Class A rates and sell at Class B rates. And then additionally, because we are the emergency power suppliers, we opted to pay the premium to go with natural gas generators.
Yeah.
So we can actually use those for curtailment as well for GA busting or trying to offset that.
That electricity piece is quite interesting. So
Mhm.
you as creative you're a new load customer with Toronto Hydro,
Yes,
and you're also a distributed generator.
that's right.
We can talk about that process in a minute.
Sorry, I should be careful. I know we spent a lot of legal work trying to figure out what we are and what we are not from a regulatory perspective. So
Yeah.
I don't know the exact term, but I will say we are only within the parcel and the property line, because as soon as we cross the
Yes,
property
right.
line, we have some regulatory burden that was not worthwhile. So
Agreed.
but
But you're going to have your relationship with Toronto Hydro, and then you're going to have another relationship with the developer, or like
with the operator of the buildings,
Okay.
yeah, and it really will be the developer because
Okay.
they are purpose-built rental.
Gotcha. And so you're going to have 4 or 5 meters, depending on how many towers there are, and that's kind of how it's going to work.
That's exactly how it's
Yeah,
going to
okay.
work. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
and we take the GA risk as well. So if
Okay.
we were sleeping at the wheel and we missed
Yeah.
a peak and we paid for that, that's our risk.
Okay. And are you signing long-term contracts with these purpose-built rentals, or you're going to pass through you're taking the risk, so it sounds like you're giving them a fixed price for the duration of a contract?
We give so the way we and this is fairly typical in most utility models, as I'm sure you're aware, we have a fixed and a variable price regime, where the fixed price is essentially to recover our capital.
Yep.
And then the variable is the flow-through costs in terms of commodities, whether it's water for a cooling tower, electricity, natural gas we purchase. But we do have to commit on the GA peaking. We have to take some of the risk on that, as well as the plant efficiency.
Yeah, okay.
And so if we end up operating that plant far less efficiently than we thought,
Right.
we're the ones paying for that, not
Yeah.
our customers and not our users.
Right.
So that's sort of that division. From a term life, we own the assets in perpetuity. That's our business. We're flexible. There's times we might look at a concessionaire agreement, but typically speaking, those are our assets. We'll own them in perpetuity, but we'll enter into long-term service agreements that are generally ranging from 20 to 30 years, which various different clauses to give people peace of mind in case there's a rockiness in the relationship, which there generally isn't. So that's the way that one looks, but typically what we see, and we see this in Vancouver all the time, our customers want to renew. They say, why would I want to go and have our own assets, take up our own space, operate our own plants? Our core business is operating a rental space or whatever it is. And our core business is supplying good, renewable, and resilient energy.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit about the technology, and then I want to come back to the kind of environmental piece.
Mm-hmm.
The technology, can you tell us a bit about the CHP configuration, what technology, size, that kind of stuff?
Sure. and I'm not going to give you, or I won't be able to give you all the details because I don't know it off the top of my
Sure.
head, but we've got about a megawatt, as I understand,
Okay, cool.
of CHP
Nice.
there, which covers roughly our base load, and then we've got a few hundred kilowatts of solar, so that's on the electrical side.
Yeah.
I don't,
CHP is a single machine, two machines?
single machine.
Okay.
Yeah, single machine.
Caterpillar, Jenbacher,
Siemens.
Siemens. Oh, wow.
Siemens.
Cool.
Yep.
Nice. The new, okay.
Yep.
Fun.
Siemens.
Okay.
I think it's funny, I posted something on LinkedIn about when we ordered the machine,
Yes.
and I guess our contractor was talking to a few people, and I got a call from one of the unsuccessful vendors saying, "Hey, I thought we were getting that contract." I'm like, "I have no idea. I'm not. I'm not the project manager."
Right.
I
Cool.
think I put my foot in my mouth.
Okay.
as
So are you going to be done and the load will be there already, or like I don't know a lot about multi-res development, but my sense is it takes a while. Like, are you going to be built and the load will be there, or?
We will. No, so we will be built and the load will come very shortly after.
Okay.
The typical process, if we're working with a development partner and we say we want you guys to be done and then we'll energize,
Yeah.
they're going to laugh us out of the room, and so we actually have to be there first, and we have
Yeah.
to make absolute certain that we're never the critical path.
I see.
To a developer, if you introduce risk, that's the worst thing. So luckily, we're never that critical path, so we will be done our piece far before occupancy, so we'll be able to energize, commission, do those things,
Yeah.
and then the load will probably come in months or a year after.
Right.
But it's a very short time window, and we do have that load certainty, which is how we were able to move that project forward.
But you're sitting on capital that won't be seeing a return for a period of time.
For a
right?
few months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's that's right.
Yeah. So coming in.
And I should mention, this is the way that we do our rate developments, our pro formas. That's all taken into account as
Gotcha.
well to make sure the
Okay.
economics work out.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. So, coming to Ontario, similar to BC, there is how does the GHG emissions, if you look at it from there are different ways to cut this pie, but I guess my question is, from the perspective of the developer and the perspective of creative, a job like that where you're burning incremental gas
Mhm.
on a site basis.
Mhm.
How do you look at that from a GHG perspective? Does the developer, handle that? Do you handle it? Talk to us a bit about, especially contrasting it with your campus story from
Mhm.
prior. How does this measure up against that?
Sure. And maybe there's a few different questions there that I'll unpack. So I think the first thing you said is, how does BC and Ontario stack up from that GHG conversation?
Yeah, I see them as similar, but
Well,
I don't have the same perspective you do.
and I don't think they are at the provincial level.
Okay.
And I'm going to try not to get political here, because I
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
something we'll keep to ourselves. But politically, there's far more leadership in British Columbia than there is in Ontario at the provincial level.
Okay.
You look at British Columbia, they've released what they call the STEP code, which is a fairly defined process of how we can get to net zero or net zero ready in a very short amount of time.
Okay.
You look at the Ontario building code, there's not a whole lot there other than saying be a few percent better than Ashrae.
Okay.
So provincially, there's far more leadership there.
Okay.
There's also the Clean BC Action Plan, which is looking at not just buildings, but how we electrify buses and how we electrify vehicles and how we electrify our ferries, so on
Yeah.
and so forth. So at the provincial level, fundamentally different. Where it becomes a lot more similar is at the municipal level. So if you compare Toronto and you compare Vancouver and Toronto both have bylaws that go over and above your
Okay.
provincial regulations, and they're both very aggressive.
Right.
And I'm a bit of a bigger fan of Toronto's policy, because they actually put a limit on carbon, whereas you look at the STEP code in British Columbia. I support the STEP code. I think it's a phenomenal step forward, but it measures energy reduction for the most part and energy efficiency, but it is silent on carbon. And I'm sort of the belief that if we as a society want to reduce carbon, we should make sure that that's one of the metrics we have to hit.
Right.
So that's sort of the contrast I
That's
see.
great contrast. Thank you.
And I also would say that I've seen British Columbia maybe be a few years ahead of Ontario in terms
Yes.
of what it's done and just culturally
Yeah.
on that front. So that answers hopefully that first
Yeah,
piece of your
yeah,
question. The second piece is Mirvish Village, and what does CHP look like in today's sort of utility and carbon era?
That's a lot more concise way of asking the question. Thank you.
I've thought about this question
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
because it's a question we have to answer.
Yeah.
So when you look at this project, I think that we started this project in 2013. If you remember that era, it was a
Yes.
very different conversation,
Totally.
both around carbon, but also around CHP. CHP at the time was a very favored technology in the province. There was
Yep.
incentive money for it.
Yep.
And so that was a very different atmosphere for that to begin with. And then the other thing, when we put the project together and sat down with all the stakeholders, there's 3 driving themes, and really in this order. First was affordability. This is affordable housing and purpose-built rental.
Gotcha.
So that is number 1.
Yeah.
The second was resiliency.
Okay.
And then the third was sustainability from a carbon perspective. And I say carbon because I kind of use sustainability in a greater sense that includes triple bottom line type of analysis. And so when you look at that, we did obviously examine what does a geothermal system look like in there, what are the different options we can look at, but to make the economics work, CHP is what established it. And it was really because of that spark spread if you look at what the gas prices are and what the electricity prices are.
Yeah, okay.
So that's the decision-making process we got there, and it's kind of, I don't want to say funny, but it's interesting. If we want to stop using natural gas, you look at that spark spread, we have to close that spread, and that's where I think carbon policy is going to play into account, whether it's carbon taxation or things like the Toronto Green Standard that says this is your carbon intensity per building, and you can't go more than that.
Right, okay.
But without those, you're sort of asking the developer or the users, really, at the end of the day, to pay additional money but based on their own goodwill, which I think public sector institutions will do. That's their role for a large part. I don't think we're going to see that from affordable housing or from private developers.
No.
So that's a little bit of the context there. From an actual carbon accounting perspective, at the time when we submitted to the city, I think the carbon accounting on our site came down about 5% lower than business as usual collectively.
Okay.
Now keep in mind that there was other energy measures in there, such as solar and such as we spent quite a bit of money on having a very, very efficient chiller, things like that. So compared to business as usual, we were a little bit lower, and we were certified under the TGS version 2. I forget the T or the version 2 tier 2. And so we were able to hit that without the CHP. I believe we were not hitting the energy use intensity targets. So the CHP actually allowed us to hit those targets. I don't think they would allow us to hit V3 tier 2. What's interesting about CHP though is it depends a lot on what the grid intensity is. And this I'm learning, and I'm by no means an expert, so I want to just make that clear for everybody. I'm a layperson with an interest on this front. The grid intensity is a conversation that I find is very, very loose here. One of the best white papers I've come across, and I actually brought it but forgot to take it out of my bag, is a paper that the Atmospheric Fund put together, and it's called something about quantifying the grid intensity of Ontario. And they explain what the average intensities are, which is a very low number. It's a very clean grid. But then they go into what the marginal emissions factors are, and saying if you're going to add a kilowatt to the grid, what's the actual generator that's going to be, right? And when you start looking at marginal intensities, it's still a clean grid, but it's a very different story. So if you look at that, all of a sudden the CHP starts making a little bit more sense. And then the other thing that they do there is they look and say, well, what's the forecast? We know that our grid, based on current political trends and what the appetites that we've seen as a province, we know it's getting dirtier. We know that Pickering is coming offline. And we know that as we're adding more capacity, there's no more hydro to be done. I don't think that solar and wind are really going to be covering that gap as much as it would be nice if they could. So it's going to be coming down to natural gas, and they've forecasted out what those marginal trends look like in terms of, I think, out to 2035. And we see a bit of an inflection point that, based on that forecast, at around 2030, it becomes cleaner to use CHP than the grid. So that's a forecast. It could change, and I know that there's some people who have challenged the methodology they've used. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but it's an interesting, nuanced conversation. And so we found 2 things. One, we can run that CHP depending on time of day that we run it. There can be carbon benefit. The other thing is, today it might not be the best solution from a carbon perspective, but as we're dirtying that grid up, it is becoming more and more attractive down the road. And then the last thing, and this is more of a holistic district energy type of mentality that I think anybody in the sector would agree with, to start off, to establish a thermal network is key. And so the big question is always, how do we make the economics work to establish that thermal network? Once we have that, there's all sorts of things we can do. We can start adding renewables, we can start adding solar, we can start adding storage, we can look at hydrogen fuel cells and start replacing it with biogas. But you have to have the economics to establish that thermal network, and that's what we were able to do. Without that thermal network, it's really hard to incorporate renewables down the road. So the timing of renewables is fundamental in district energy, and that's what we were able to do with Mirvish Village. We're now already talking with neighbors who've actually approached us to say, hey, we want to connect to your system. And as we're doing that, expanding team development there, it's really exciting because that's where we get to do a little bit more sophisticated and fun things, such as looking at phase change technology for thermal storage, or looking at solar integration, or how do we integrate the electrical and the thermal and start using storage in a sense that's not your typical batteries. Or the one thing we did examine that is didn't pan out in this case, but we're really eager to get it working, is using EV as storage. If we're going to have all these car batteries that are connected already, can we actually use people's cars to store energy? And I actually think the next couple of years we're going to be able to crack that nut.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up that piece about the atmospheric fund because, and maybe it's linked, maybe it's not. We've always been fans of some work that Akil Zaidi of Enbridge Gas has done. He's going to be on one of our upcoming episodes, but similar thing. Looking at the marginal KW and where's that coming from, and it's similar to your story about how you framed that project for the school that I forget the name of already.
Thompson University.
The way you reframed that comparison is what Atmospheric Fund and what Enbridge are doing. They're reframing the comparison. Yes, if you take every kWh in the province and you look at the intensity of every kWh, okay, but in reality, we are displacing, gas on the margin, right? If we put in cogeneration, which is a higher cycle efficiency than, the plants on the 401, for example, that's what we're displacing. We're displacing those kWh. And then, the other piece that, we want to advocate for in terms of DG, particularly CHP, is the ancillary benefits, right? As our grid gets smarter, that 1 megawatt that you have there, that Siemens machine, that's going to potentially have the ability to provide, VAR support or, other resiliency beyond your property there, out into the network, right, with Toronto Hydro. And there's no way to, make that, financial compensation yet, but, our hope is that will come, and that's one of the benefits, and that's the trouble with CHP, is there's benefits that are hard to A, understand, if you're not deep in the bug dust, and B, they're harder to quantify, and they're incremental in nature. But
yeah, and the one thing I'll say, so we're technologically agnostic. We don't take a stance on what's the right technology. We look at every project as a blank slate and try to craft the best solution based on what we're working with. So I'm not taking a stance on CHP one way or another, but there's no way to say that it is not one of the best things for resiliency. And so if we're defining that project as resiliency and affordability, CHP certainly checks those two boxes. When you're looking at the carbon piece of it, it's questionable or potentially not great today, but there's certainly a case to be made down the road. So it's a very nuanced conversation that I find is not really talked about enough, especially at the grid intensity piece of it. And it's interesting, like I said, I'm a layperson on this, but the one, and I want to say misconception, though I can't verify this 100%, when I was talking with some of the folks who are really proponents of electrifying everything and going to the grid, which I actually think is a fantastic idea, but one of the things that I would hear over and over again is, in Ontario, you only use gas in the grid during the peaks, and that's it. And to me, that makes sense. It's, you have your nuclear, you have your hydro, that covers your baseload, and the gas turns on at the peaks. And when I actually sat down with the Atmospheric Fund, because I want to understand how they came up with that white paper that unfortunately nobody reads, but I think it's a phenomenal paper, I questioned them on that. They said, that's intuitively what makes sense. That's not the reality. We actually looked hour by hour what generators turn on, and that is a fallacy to say that. So I haven't verified the data, but it's a really interesting, what I think is a misconception. I don't know the rationale why that happens, but it's a very nuanced conversation that I don't think gets the attention it deserves.
And I think the reality is that, whether it's nuclear or hydro or wind or solar, they are, to the masses, intuitive and easy to understand. Right, and so I think a gas plant has a terrible connotation to it, and it's a lot harder to understand. It's just we gravitate to what's easy, right? And so it's easy to understand that, and it's easy to be excited and think and it markets well that, hey, in Ontario, it's all clean energy, right? And that markets well, and it's not wrong. It's not right, but it's not wrong either. And then we have an announcement like just recently where they extend the life of Pickering, and that makes the whole thing a little bit more confusing. So what's...
Well, and maybe just to cap that conversation, what's interesting too is if you say, let's take Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia, I don't think we're ever going to see the days where CHP makes sense in BC, except for biomass off a wood mill or something like that.
Right on.
You go to Alberta, I think CHP is probably one of the most sustainable things you can do, because if you have coal generation at the grid, and now you're burning gas for that, that's a slam dunk.
Well, and that you bring up a topic that I was hoping to just like, it's all, unfortunately, in our space, a lot of life is relative, right? Like you talked about in the 60s, the late 60s, moving from coal to gas was a really, now in BC, it's moving away from coal, or moving away from gas rather. Here in Ontario, same thing. We're moving. We've essentially moved, almost off of gas, but we have some infrastructure. But to your point, in Alberta, particularly for us, that's our biggest area of business for the next foreseeable future, because their frame of reference, like the business cases we talked about, is dirty. It's very dirty, and so we serve some big utility clients out there who are just giddy about burning natural gas, and they're just unashamed. And so, yeah, it's, I don't think that the economics are not, like, we can't leapfrog that step in development, right? Like, I think even though the technology's there, it won't happen to go from coal to biomass in Alberta, or coal to RNG. It has to be kind of a step development. You have to go through the phases, I think, but I'm interested if you have a different opinion on that.
Oh, and I couldn't agree more. So to me, I think natural gas is a really good transition fuel. I really do.
That's a good term.
And I think when people say natural gas is dirty, I don't think that's the right term for it, because I think coal is dirty. I think natural gas, we ultimately have to get off of gas. I completely agree. But it's a matter of how we do that, how long it takes to do that. And at the end of the day, we're generally driven by economics.
Bingo.
Right. And so if we want to say Ontario, if we really want to say no more natural gas in buildings, people are not going to voluntarily say we want to pay more for our rates. Right. And so we have to have government come in and put in policy that drives economics. And that's where I think the carbon tax is going to be really, really big. Right. That's a dial that you can turn and crank up and try to mix the markets up a little bit.
What do you make of this, this thought floating around that, well, carbon tax, but you got to get to a big number, a 3-digit number, before you drive change? You subscribe to that notion that we got to get to $100, $150 a ton before we're going to see any substantial change in behavior?
I don't subscribe to that notion at all. And the reason I say that is because I don't think that it's going to be one or the other. I think it's very transitionary. And so if we run an economic model, we're looking at a project. Generally, we'll start off with, we want to do something very sustainable. However, we're bound by economics and have to work with our development partners or customers to understand what that looks like. We'll model out 2 different scenarios, and there's certain things, particularly when we're looking at scale, that we can leverage the economy of scale to make some more sustainable electric-based solutions work, or bring the cost down, but that cost of gas might still be cheaper. And so we find that by, say, 2022, when it goes up to $50 a ton, all of a sudden, I think here, I did the math the other day, it goes from roughly $22 or $23 a megawatt hour to $30 a megawatt hour. All of a sudden, there's all sorts of strategies we would look at that before it would not have actually panned out, and now the economics pencil in. So I don't think it's going to be quite that binary. I do think it's going to be a little bit more analog in terms of how we transition.
So in our office, we talk a lot about a post-carbon plan. And what post-carbon is maybe not, it's a nice term, but there will still be burning carbon. It's just a matter of, is it in the existing carbon cycle, or are we pulling it out of the ground? But we're thinking about things like RNG and biomass and biogas and hydrogen. What does Creative Energy's post-carbon, because you're coming out of a Vancouver framework, you're here, you must be thinking and plotting and kind of dreaming about what those technologies or those plans are. Can you share with us some of the stuff that you have on the radar, even you're starting to think about in terms of the next wave of either fuels or technology?
Yeah, and I might break it down to 2 things. I think one of them is not the next wave. One of them is what we're doing today. And I can point to a couple projects where it is mostly post-carbon, and we're making it work. So I can show that. And then what we're doing, say, down the road, or what we're starting to salivate over in terms of me and my engineering cohort saying we can't wait for this to become technically or commercially viable. But just today, what we have in development, if you look at Oak Ridge in Vancouver, so that's a site that's being developed. It's about 14 towers and 5 million square feet of real estate.
Okay, cool. Wow.
We're developing the district energy there, and we're meeting the low carbon requirements of the city of Vancouver. And I could get this wrong, but I think it's 4 or 6 kilograms per meter square per year. And just to give you context, if you were to go meet the next iteration of the Toronto Green Standard here and hit tier 2, it's at 15. So and we're not even there today. So so just to give you that sort of that gap. So by all definitely. I mean,
It's aggressive.
yeah, it's a very aggressive, and we're halfway in the development right now. We're making it work. We've got a large geothermal component.
Cool.
We've got
Okay.
some electric resistant boilers for some carbon dosing. We've got some conventional gas as well.
Okay.
But we're doing that today, and that is I think we're looking at 30 megawatts of capacity on heating and cooling
Okay.
and low carbon.
Cool.
Another project and I really like this project from a technological perspective, a little bit smaller, but if you look in West Vancouver,
Yes.
there's a Horseshoe Bay development, which is about 7 buildings in a small resort village.
Okay.
What we're doing there, we purchased, and we have it in a shop right now. We've purchased two heat exchangers that are probably the size of this room.
Yeah.
We are sinking them to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They're going to land on the ocean floor and live there. We're putting piping on the seabed, bringing it up to the building, tying it to an array of heat pumps, and we're extracting. The numbers vary, we don't know exactly yet, but we're thinking potentially up to 50 to 90% of the thermal energy will be from the ocean.
Okay.
And so
Wow.
our natural gas boiler is only there for peak heating
No way.
and to do a little bit of lift on domestic hot water because of a temperature differential.
Yes.
And we have no cooling tower there because the Pacific Ocean is our cooling tower.
Wow.
And
Cool.
so that
Nice.
project's in construction right now. So that's why I'm saying it's not
Okay.
far out in
Cool.
terms of
Yeah.
post-carbon future. We're
Yeah.
seeing it today.
Yeah. Awesome.
What we are starting to see, I think, more to your question in terms of the future technologies, what's coming down the pipeline, we're really excited about advancements in thermal storage.
Okay.
I think that is going to be one of the biggest things. And I think the conversation, at least publicly, everybody thinks batteries when they think thermal storage. I think we have to stop that thinking.
Yeah.
They certainly have a big role to play, but
Yeah.
there's all sorts of things out there, whether it's ice storage. The new technology I'm really excited about that we're seeing in Asia, we're seeing it in the States, a little bit in Europe, and we're looking at a project, see if we can implement it, hasn't been done in Canada, is phase change materials.
Yeah. Cool.
Which is essentially engineered polymers that will freeze and melt at
Yes.
temperatures you design to, so you get that latent thermal storage without having to get to sub-freezing temperatures like you would with ice.
Yeah.
We're seeing flywheels now for thermal energy storage. We're seeing,
Thermal energy with a flywheel.
electrical energy storage.
Okay, yes,
yeah,
yes.
electrical energy.
Sure, yeah.
We're seeing, and I'm sure you guys have seen this project. I think it's in Ontario where they're looking at compressed air.
Hydro
Hydro.
yeah.
Obviously, there's pumped hydro,
Yeah.
but there is all sorts of different technologies out
Yeah.
there. And I think the more we start integrating thermal and electrical systems together,
Yeah.
the more we're going to get flexibility on how we store energy.
Yeah.
And I mean, the most conventional example is if electricity is cheap at night, go run a chiller, produce ice, and then you've got ice for the next day, and
Yeah.
you just stored. It's really storing electrical energy in a sense,
Yeah.
right? And so that's where I think the conversation is going. What we're really excited about.
Yeah.
And then the other technologies is hydrogen. Obviously, that's one we're all excited about.
Yeah.
Seeing batteries come down in price a little bit.
Yeah.
That's probably what we're seeing. And then as heat pumps are becoming better every day, I really think that heat pumps are going to take over the world
Yeah.
from a thermal perspective. And
Yeah,
so seeing
yeah.
the advancements there are
Cool.
what I think we're most excited about.
Yeah, we're doing a project right now up in Timmins at the hospital there, and they were one of the, in Ontario at least, one of the pioneers in ice storage. They have an ice storage system there that we've gotten a little bit close to from an audit perspective, and yeah, it's pretty elegant. Like, it's pretty simple.
It is.
But it drives results, right? And so yeah, what I always tell people is it's a really exciting time to be, in the industry. It's challenging, it's complex, but it's pretty exciting too.
Yeah, and just back to the point too about the Mirvish Village, the thermal network.
Yes.
One of the things that, and I don't know if you or any of your viewers prescribe to Ray Kurzweil and have ever seen his sort of theory of the way technology evolves.
Okay.
That as technology builds on itself, it's exponential, and so
Uh-huh.
the rate of advancement is not linear. It's going to be
Okay.
going up astronomically. But what that means is that what we might think is the latest and greatest today is going to start changing quicker and quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
And so having the ability to establish a thermal network that's flexible, so then as hydrogen all of a sudden becomes economical, or we
Yeah.
see PCMs really taking off, or compressed air, whatever it might be, we have that infrastructure there to actually mix and match different technologies and have that fuel flexibility.
Yeah.
And I think fundamentally from a district energy perspective, forget about us and creative, just
Yeah.
the district energy value, I think one of the big things is that flexibility, and nowhere has it been done better than in Europe. You go
Yeah.
look at Copenhagen, you've got these, we get to brag about 14 kilometers of piping, which
Yeah.
I think is the biggest or the second biggest in all of Canada.
Okay.
If you go there, they've got 100 kilometers of piping in their
Yeah.
cities, and they've got waste heat from garbage one waste heat from a tomato plant somewhere. They've got renewable. That's really where I think things get interesting.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of fuss, and maybe this is an Ontario thing because we've always been an electricity province, not we haven't really looked at energy from a holistic perspective. But there's lots of, talk about how the electrical grid is getting more complicated and smarter and diverse, and you have DERs and DGs or whatever, acronym you want to throw at it. But you raise a great point. We also need to be thinking about that flexibility and a smart thermal grid, right? And it's maybe less sexy than the electricity side for some, not for us, but for some. But that on a cold winter day like we have today, we gotta really start thinking about that kind of stuff, right?
Absolutely, and I'm a prescriber that I think, if we want to call it our issue, and it's not really an issue, but Canada's always had access to very affordable energy.
Yes.
Right, and so you go look at Copenhagen, which I think 97% of their heating is through a district system and a thermal network.
Yeah.
I don't think that they wanted to be the leaders because it's the nice thing to do. I think they had no choice. They had expensive energy, they had coal, they had density. They said this is what makes the most sense.
Yeah.
I think as carbon policies change and the Greta Thunbergs of the world become more popular, and people actually start caring, I think that we're going to start seeing Canada go that way as well. And just 3 weeks ago, I think CBC posted an article on district energy, which to me is,
cool.
wow, this is really going mainstream if you have the Canadian Broadcast Corporation doing that.
Yeah, and it's tough. Like it's a bit of an uphill battle, right? Because it's not AI, it's not virtual reality, it's not big tech, it's not sexy, but it's essential. Right? It's what we need.
Well, and it's funny, it's just going back to the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about us as engineers. We don't really get taught on some of the soft skills and EQ, and this is probably my blind spot as an engineer. I think it's all those things. I think it is sexy, right? You're right, though. I go home and talk to my other half and tell her about everything we do. She humors me because she's nice and loves me.
Right, yes, I understand.
But yeah, it's not sexy to them, but to me, I think it's the coolest thing in the world.
Agreed. Cool. Well, this has been fun. I appreciate you making time for us. We could probably sit here and talk all day about this, I think. What's the best way for people to find you or begin a dialogue with creative? Sure.
So the way to find me, which is probably easiest, I'm not a huge social media guy except for LinkedIn. I do have that, and so look me up on LinkedIn, either Creative Energy or myself or both. Send me a message. We're very happy to talk. Cool. And then the other one is through our website. We'll show our projects there, show the way that we do work, just some explanatory things in terms of what district energy is. And we're here to stay, so we're really excited to see what we can get off the ground here, and it's moving very fast.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was really fun. It was good to chat with somebody who's thinking about the same things and struggling with the same things as us, and at the same time, it's clear you have a passion for this. So this was fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. First time I've been on a podcast, so it was a lot of fun.
You did great. You have a future in it for sure.
Yes. So, Joe Rogan next.
That's right. Yeah. Set the sights high. So thank you to all of our listeners and those who are viewing. We just appreciate you. And so this was episode 14 of Energy Radio, and it's been a pleasure to chat with Diego, and hope you enjoyed it.